Welcome to our online professional development titled The ABCs of Supporting Students with Disabilities in Elementary Settings. This training is appropriate for substitute teachers supporting students with exceptional needs across all settings at the elementary level. My name is Marissa Waddy, and I'm a special education consultant at the Northern Kentucky Cooperative. Before joining NKCES, I was a special education professor and a teacher for 20 years, serving students in a variety of settings. I'm excited to share helpful tips for a successful day as a substitute teacher because you are such a vital member of the educational team. So let's get started. This training will cover what I'm calling the ABCs, which will include accommodations and the IEP, behavior supports, communication and consistency, dignity for our students, and then finally, expectations across the different settings where you will probably find yourself. So let's begin with A, the accommodations and the IEP. So, first, what is an IEP? An IEP is an individualized education plan. It's a written statement of the educational program that's been designed to meet a child's individual needs. Every child who receives special education services has an IEP. Teachers use IEPs to guide them in accommodating and modifying how they design their lessons and instruction in the classroom. As a substitute teacher, you may or may not have access to IEP information, so we'll talk about the basics that you definitely do need to know throughout this training. The teacher that you are covering for may indicate that a particular student has specific needs or adaptations, and these could be outlined in that student's IEP. So it's important to follow any of the instructions that the classroom teacher leaves regarding specific students. Each student's IEP includes their individualized accommodations that allow them to effectively access curriculum content and demonstrate their understanding on assessments. It's imperative that students receive these accommodations consistently, so you need to be aware of what each student should receive. The teacher that you're covering for should leave this information in your subfolder or just within the lesson plans as they apply to specific activities. Common examples of accommodations that students would receive include the use of assistive technology, such as a device for reading or typing. They might also receive a reader for assessments, and perhaps a scribe, which is assistance help with the student writing their thoughts to complete a writing task or an assessment. Be sure to note the accommodations that you provide to each student in your summary to the teacher because we are required to document those things as well. One challenging but important consideration is to be discreet when providing these accommodations for students. We'll talk about this more later when we talk about protecting our students' dignity. But basically, you want to look for ways to provide these accommodations in ways that don't draw unwanted attention or embarrass the student. So, for example, providing a visual cue to invite the student to join you at the small table for accommodations instead of just calling the student out loud and things like that that do sometimes embarrass our learners. B is for behavior supports. Sometimes behavior challenges can be the most difficult aspect of coming into an unfamiliar classroom. So let's talk about some basic strategies for a safe and productive day. Students with disabilities, including autism or students with anxiety or even trauma backgrounds, crave predictable, consistent routines. So, already having a substitute teacher can be anxiety provoking just because it alters the predictability that these students crave. And that can lead to acting out behaviors. Your most effective behavior approach is a proactive one, preventing problems behaviors from occurring in the first place through the use of several simple evidence-based approaches. First, offer choice as much as possible. So, this means that you would provide 2 to 3 acceptable options and then wait for the student to choose. This is helpful for the whole group, small groups, or individual students. Remember to stick to the consistent routine as much as possible, which we'll discuss in a moment, but you can still offer choices of, let's say, working individually or in partners, or giving 2 to 3 activities for break times, or offering a choice of whether they want to work with pencil paper or on a device. Those are just a few examples, but offering choice builds student engagement and reduces power struggles. So you definitely want to look for those opportunities. Next, and sometimes this might not seem like a behavior strategy, but it really is, as much as possible, use visual prompts and cues for students. Students process visual information more efficiently than verbal information, especially when they're feeling stressed. So, examples of this could be to use quick checklist, visual signals, and picture supports as much as possible. And I'll give you some examples of those and some resources for those later in the presentation. One example, however, is to use visual timers and simple countdowns. So, visual timers are a powerful motivator and a tool for keeping students engaged and focused. They are easily found on YouTube, and which you could then project onto a screen for any number of minutes if you're teaching in the classroom, or certainly just easily add to slides if you're teaching virtually. And you can search by any number of minutes, which is really nice. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. You can also use sand timers, which can be purchased for as little as 99 cents or would hopefully already be available in the classroom where you're serving, or any other digital timer to help students prepare for transitions, which we know can be some of the most challenging times of the day. Also, simple countdowns that you jot on a post it note can be helpful for individual students as well. So, for example, to help prepare a student to transition, you might simply take a post it note and jot a 3, 2, 1 on that note and then put it on their desk once you've kind of given them a prompt as to what that is for. And then you use that as a countdown. Each time you kind of circulate around the room, just cross off that number. So first you cross off the 3, circulate around, take approximately a minute, cross off the 2, and then cross off the 1. So the student again has that visual countdown of how much time is remaining before that difficult transition. Another proactive strategy is to use what we call proximity, and I'm going to pair that with another evidence based strategy of active supervision because they really do go together. So often, just walking near a student who is off task can prompt him or her to return to that desired behavior. This also keeps you from having to call out the student verbally, which can sometimes escalate a student's behavior. Usually, just moving to close proximity will adjust a student's behavior without you having to say anything. And that is a great strategy to use at any grade level and is respectful of student dignity by not having to call them out or embarrass them. The evidence based strategy of active supervision includes proximity as well. So, once you're confident that the students understand the expectations you've given during work time, you provide the cue or the prompt for them to begin. And then while they're engaged in the task, active supervision means you are moving around the room, scanning and monitoring, but you're also using what we call pre corrections, which would just be those reminders about what the expectations are, or giving those visual prompts to signal to students that you're monitoring and that you're there to support them. You're also frequently reinforcing or praising desired behavior and, as necessary, privately correcting behaviors or errors as students are working to help them be more successful. And then finally, and this kind of goes throughout each of these strategies as well, you're providing frequent positive feedback. And that is a critical piece of each of these strategies that I've shared. So you're monitoring student progress, you're providing specific positive feedback as much as you possibly can throughout the day. And specific means you are really stating exactly what it is that you're praising. So instead of saying good job, we say things like, I love the way you are working on that math problem. Great job using your strategies. Things like that that really help cue not only that student into their appropriate behaviors, but it's also another reminder for the students around them as well. So, hopefully, in most of the classrooms that you lead, you are walking into an effective classroom management system that you can easily implement for a successful day. However, I did want to share one research based group behavior intervention that you could easily implement when you need it. I served as a substitute teacher for a good little while before I started in the classroom. So I know how difficult some of those days can be when you just don't feel like you quite have a handle on that management system. So it was helpful for me to kind of have some things in my back pocket that could implement when I need it. The good behavior game is an approach to the management of classroom behaviors that rewards students for displaying appropriate on task behaviors during specific instructional times that you're going to identify for them. The class is divided into two teams, and you give a point to teams when you actually see inappropriate behavior. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would expect, but that's how it's been proven in the evidence based. So you're kind of like tallying inappropriate behaviors that you've identified for students. So the team with the fewest number of points when the game ends wins that group reward. So it's a group contingency. If both teams keep their points below a level that you've given them, then both teams share the reward. So that is keeping it positive. The program has been around for decades, and several studies have confirmed that it is an effective means of increasing on task behavior while reducing disruptions in the classroom. Both of those are the goal. The process of introducing the good behavior game into a classroom is pretty simple. There are 5 steps that we're going to briefly explore here. So, the first step is for you to decide when you're going to actually run the game. So, as a rule of thumb, you pick those times when the entire class is expected to show appropriate academic behaviors. So, blocks of time devoted usually to reading, math, any other content instruction, and even independent seat work would be those appropriate blocks of time for putting the game into effect. And then next, you clearly define those negative behaviors that are going to be scored, that are going to be counted during the game. Typically, teachers define 3 types of these negative behaviors that you're going to score whenever they appear during the game. And those behaviors are leaving one seat, talking out, or engaging in any disruptive behavior. Then you decide upon whatever reasonable daily for your short term sub positions. And if it's a longer term sub position, you might have a weekly reward for teams that win the game. Most often, again, you don't want this to be anything you're spending money on or having to carry around with you. So, usually, teachers use free time as that daily reward, and most children find that motivating. So, for one example, one teacher's reward system included giving them privileges of like wearing a victory tag, putting a star next to their names on a winner's chart, lining up first for lunch, getting 30 minutes of time at the end of the day to work on fun but still educationally relevant topics. Those are just some examples that we've seen teachers use. When choosing those rewards, you're advised to consider those reinforcers that fit naturally into the classroom. So, for example, allowing winners to play quietly together at the end of the school day promotes social skills. But giving tangible rewards like candy is probably a little less relevant to those educational and social goals. Plus, that's expense and logistics for you that we don't want you to have to worry about. Of course, if both teams win on a given day or a given week, then all members of the teams receive the same rewards. Next, you actually introduce the game to the class. So you have to set aside some time to kind of briefly introduce what that game is at the beginning of the day or beginning of the session. You tell students you're going to be playing this game and you show them the schedule of when the game is going to be in effect. Typically, it's not in effect the entire day because then it can kind of lose some interest for the students. So you really are identifying a specific time or times when you're running the game. Divide the class into 2 teams. Usually, just to make it easier for you, it's just, dividing the class right down the center of the room. You can divide into more than 2 teams if you have a really large class or if you have students organized into groups already, you can certainly do that. To help students build that team spirit, you can encourage them to name their teams, that kind of thing. And then you explicitly teach them what those behaviors are that are going to earn those points and help them understand that you're getting tallies for those inappropriate behaviors like leaving your seat, talking out, or disrupting the class. You help them understand that both teams can win if they earn no more than, and you set that number of points, like 4 points for the day. Then, if you have a situation where both teams happen to exceed that, then the team with the lowest total at the end of the day is the winner. You are the final judge of whether a behavior is to be scored. So you explain that to them right at the beginning. So there shouldn't be any arguments. And remember, it's just really important to help students know the rules. So it's probably a good idea to clearly give examples of acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. And you might even include them in that. So have children act them out quickly, or as you're describing behaviors, have them show hands. If this acceptable, would I score this, or would I not score this? So there everyone is clear before you start the game. And then finally, you put the game into effect. So during those times of the day when the game is in effect in your classroom, you are going about your typical instructional routines. The only alteration is that you are noting and recording any of those negative points by either team, usually on the board or on chart paper. So it's visible for everyone. When you're working with children in small groups, you can use notepads or little whiteboards, things like that. That's fine too. You can also choose to publicly announce when points have been earned to remind students about acceptable behaviors. But remember, if you're doing that, you don't want to be calling out individual students because while we're doing this, we're also protecting student dignity and we're being mindful of not escalating inappropriate behaviors as well or disrupting instruction. You want to be consistent as much as possible as you're scoring those negative behaviors and also be consistent in praising and rewarding students and teams for those appropriate behaviors. One final note for those times, and especially when we're working with students that might have special needs, especially behavioral needs, you might run into issues with small numbers of students who are sabotaging the game, whether that be intentionally or even unintentionally for students who do have behavior challenges. And you want to address that so that you don't end up with, a negative climate in your classroom all day long. So sometimes an effective approach to this, if you do have a small number of students who are earning most of those points, which is a negative thing in this game, consider forming them into their own team. So that's outside of the norm when students might be doing this, individual students or small groups of doing that. But sometimes students might find that negative social attention is still reinforcing for them. And so a simple remedy for that is to modify the game by putting those students into a separate team. And that way they're still part of this group contingency, but you're not creating or damaging relationships or causing conflict by allowing that student's challenges to implement all students or groups of students. So you continue running the game as you were, but now you have this additional team or teams competing for rewards. Okay, so now let's move on and let's talk about moving through our ABCs, the C's of communication and consistency. So these are foundational to a safe and productive school day. The first being communication. So, when you're communicating to support students with special needs, clarity is so important. And so first, and I've already alluded to this a little bit, you want to pair visual and verbal prompts and cues when possible. So that means giving instructions both verbally and visually as much as you can so that students receive clear directions that they can refer back to if needed. Examples might be to use visual aids such as charts, graphs, pictures. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how you might be able to use a whiteboard or even post it notes, anything that you can do to provide that visual reminder along with your verbal instructions can be really helpful. And then next, you want to be sure to provide wait time to give students opportunities to process directions, to process their own thoughts, to compose a response. Typically, 3 to 5 seconds after you've posed a question or a prompt is good practice. Another great approach for increasing safety for students is to tell them ahead of time that you're going to give, let's say, 30 seconds of think time to prepare a response, and even encouraging students to jot down their response and then give everyone an opportunity to briefly share with a partner before they share with a group. Any kind of way that you can support their communication is helpful as well. You also want to be brief and concise. So making activities short and as concise as possible by breaking longer activities into a series of shorter tasks, for example, breaking down activities into steps and using visuals to support, like a post-it note or a quick sketch where you've jotted down those steps, can also be really helpful for students. And then finally, another aspect that you want to be aware of when you're working with students, let's say with autism, is in the area of communication. So many of our students with autism are nonverbal, and they may use alternative means of communication, such as picture communication systems, as well as technology devices. So you want to become familiar with those forms of communication. And one way that you can do that is to quickly collaborate with the special education providers that are in and out of your room to assist you in using those forms of communication to help you be aware of how that student communicates and how to use any of those systems effectively so that you'll be prepared throughout your day. Next, we want to talk about the importance of consistency. So, along with communication clarity, we need to be mindful of maintaining consistency for these learners. So, the first way is to be as consistent with the schedule and classroom routines as possible. Students with disabilities, including autism, anxiety, or even students with trauma backgrounds, crave predictable, consistent routines. So I briefly mentioned that with B for behavior supports. Having a substitute teacher can be anxiety provoking because it alters the predictability that these students need. So, as much as possible, rely on the posted schedule and the classroom routines that you were hopefully given by the teacher that you're supporting. You also want to limit distractions and provide a safe learning environment that's going to be free from triggers. Things that in the environment that might trigger some students would include loud noises, bright lights, other things that can disrupt their focus. So, just being mindful of that can be important. You also want to set your students up for success with transitions. So, the first way is just maintaining those consistent routines, but also giving advance or repeat notice before transitions, giving clear expectations before transitions. And again, remember, using visual timers and countdowns are also great ways to support and prepare students for transitions as well. Remember that special education providers are in the room to collaborate with you and to provide services to students. So they have specific tasks that they need to complete while they're in the room. But remember that you're still responsible for what's happening in the classroom where you're leading that day. So just be sure to greet anyone who enters the room, introduce yourself to them. If possible, find out the purpose of their visit, but also don't hesitate to ask if there's something that you can do that would be helpful for the students that you are both supporting that day. They're there as a support for you as well as the students. Be sure to use the given behavior management systems, not only for the entire class, but especially for those behavior management plans that you're given for individual students. So stick to those as much as you can. And again, ask for any clarification from the special education teachers to make sure that you understand what those systems are. And then finally, and again, I've talked about this a little bit already, but this can be so important when we're talking about supporting students with exceptional needs, and it requires some courage much of the time. So be ready to ask for more information to help you implement that consistent, safe learning environment. Sometimes teachers leave what we think are crystal clear directions, behavior management plans, procedures, but they might not be crystal clear to others. And so just be ready to ask for that additional support, and everyone will appreciate that because they know that you're doing that to best support those students. Okay, moving through our alphabet. D is for dignity. And this just means that all students have the right to learn in safe, welcoming, considerate, and caring classroom environments. So let's explore ways to honor this for your students. When we think about the things we want to do to honor student dignity, the first is to protect student privacy at all times. So, when speaking with special education providers, for example, about students, make sure that those conversations are respectful, confidential, and out of earshot of all students. Students should never be identified as having a disability. So, discretion is key in protecting the information that might be shared with you that's allowing you to best meet student needs, but it shouldn't be shared with anyone else. And even for your end, we want you to ask questions, but only ask those questions that are pertinent to successfully meeting the needs of your students that day. And those conversations, again, must be held privately. Sometimes that can be challenging. So you might even need to just ask for an opportunity to do that so that you're not having to have that conversation right there in the classroom with the students. We also want to make sure that our conversations are respectful. So things like using person first language and honoring the strengths and abilities of each learner within those conversations are so important. We want to apply the principles of universal design for learning. And so we're going to talk more about UDL in just a moment. And then finally, we want to honor the needs that your students have for processing or wait time, their own autonomy, and their independence. So you want to be available for assistance, but you also hold high expectations and encourage students to attempt tasks before you jump in. We all have those days when we feel like we may not have covered enough content or completed the lessons that we would have liked, but we can still go home every day feeling like we empowered and honored our students each and every day. So, one way we do that is through these principles of universal design for learning. UDL principles help us to treat our students with dignity because when you use UDL, you're assuming that the barriers to learning are in the design of the environment, not the student. The goal of UDL is to use a variety of teaching methods to remove any barriers to learning and give all students equal opportunities to succeed. So it's about building in flexibility that can be adjusted for each student's strengths and needs, and that's why UDL benefits all kids. These design elements help people with disabilities, but often people who don't have disabilities may also want to use them. So, for example, closed captioning is designed for individuals with disabilities, but everyone can benefit from closed captioning. Things like ramps, again, are designed for individuals with disabilities, but many people may prefer to use that for access. UDL provides that same kind of flexibility in the classroom. So, by applying UDL principles, you effectively instruct a diverse group of learners. And you do this by building in flexibility in the way they access information and in the way students can demonstrate their knowledge. So, examples of this during your school day would be in providing those choices that we talked about earlier. So, allowing students to access content in ways they prefer, so through technology or through paper pencil, by providing accommodations to any students that might need them or who might want them, by giving students flexibility in how they work or where they work. Those are all examples of pretty easy ways to implement universal design for learning. While each of our ABCs so far should be appropriate no matter the setting you're in, there are also special considerations dependent on the classroom that you're leading. So let's explore a few of those. When stepping in special education settings or even in general education classrooms, be prepared for frequent collaborative or co teaching opportunities. So, first, be prepared for special education support staff to come into the classroom and either stay to support students or take one or more students out for instruction. This happens regularly, and the students typically expect to leave as scheduled. You also need to be prepared for students to come and go. So sometimes students are taken out to be tested by the special education teacher, a speech and language pathologist, or a school psychologist. If they ask to take a student whom you were not expecting to leave, that's still okay. Just make a note in the subplans so that the teacher knows that a student might have missed a portion of the instruction that was unexpected. Be involved in the instructional process. So assist all students, even if you are co teaching or collaborating with other adults in the room, circulate about the room and provide supports, active supervision, specific feedback. Those behavior strategies that we talked about earlier can really help with student engagement and foster success. And then finally, again, be mindful of student dignity. So be careful with your conversations about students and be careful of requiring oral reading by students. And this can be important, especially when we're in gen ed settings. We might forget that students in that classroom still have really diverse levels of proficiency. So, just as a general rule, you want to avoid expecting students to read aloud or to even respond aloud without giving them preparation or making sure that they're comfortable with that. Next, you might be subbing in resource or self contained settings. So, these classrooms are specifically designed for children with more severe disabilities. There typically will be fewer students and more adults. And so, the expectations here again are going to be different. So, be prepared to work with many adults who may or may not be coming in and out of the room. Depending on the level of severity of student needs, you may have multiple adults in the room with different jobs. So, this could include your speech therapist, occupational or physical therapist, and others. So, be prepared to work as a team with these providers, or be prepared for them to want to do their own thing and work independently with their students. There may also be one or more paraprofessionals or instructional assistants there to support you. Some teachers prefer that paraprofessional takes over that main teacher role when they're out of the building because, again, consistency is key, and that instructional assistant is going to be familiar with the students, the routine, and the content. But then other teachers will expect you to take the lead and have the paraprofessional or instructional assistant continue in their typical role. That should be really clear in your instructions. Feel free to chat about that with that instructional assistant at the beginning of the day. Regardless, use that paraprofessional or instructional assistant's knowledge and experience to your advantage regarding the flow of the day so you can keep that consistent schedule. They're going to know specific student needs. They can assist you with behavioral supports. They're going to be a vital support for you throughout the day. Also, be prepared to assist with a real variety of student needs. So, most children in a self contained setting are going to have various combinations of cognitive, learning, behavior, attention, self care, and communication needs in varying levels of severity and combinations. So you may find yourself providing support and assistance to children that you might think is beyond their age. So assistance with toileting, tying shoes, helping with coats and clothing, etc. But just be prepared to assist as needed. Again, student dignity. So honoring student dignity may take on a new appearance in these classrooms. When working with students who have significant physical needs, remember that their cognitive and receptive abilities may be considerably stronger than their expressive communication or their motor skills. They may appear to have lower cognitive functioning than they really do. So be mindful of that in making those assumptions and remember to speak to them at their age level unless you're told otherwise. So, in other words, don't talk down to them, just speak clearly and concisely to them using the communication system that they are proficient with. You also want to be ready to follow lesson plans and those teacher guides or intervention guides as closely as possible. Not only do students need this consistency, but these lessons usually are very structured and direct, and they have specific delivery methods and procedures for them to be effective. So you want to be prepared for that. And part of that is just being prepared for small group and even individualized instruction. So you're going to want to look through those notes, have those materials and guides ready, review those prior to leading those groups. Be sure to monitor students who are doing independent work while you're leading those small groups. It can be a challenge logistically in these settings because you will have so much going on. So just be prepared for that before students come in as much as possible. And remember to get up and move about to provide that active supervision, even while you're leading small groups. Next, we want to talk about when you're serving as the special education teacher, but you're going into frequently general education settings. So often you're going to be supporting instruction in both gen ed settings and in resource settings. That's probably a more common configuration that you'll find yourself in. So when you're in these inclusion classrooms, which is what we call a general education classroom with a diverse group of students, you're frequently going to be working with small groups or individual students, both inside and outside of the classroom. So, this is going to be a little more unique, and we want to talk about what to expect there as well. The first is to expect to be in many places throughout the day and working in those many different settings. So, be ready to be flexible. Probably wear comfortable shoes. I've made that mistake more than once. And be ready to carry around those plans with you throughout your day. Often, also, special education teachers usually do not have a homeroom. So, what they're able to serve in other capacities at times throughout the school day. So, expect to be responsible for those additional duties like lunch or recess duty, bus duty, emergency drill duty, car riders, things like that. Look for something that's posted in that classroom or in your sub plans that explain those procedures for you, and even take them with you when you go to serve in that extra duty as well. We've talked about this already, but again, be prepared to work with multiple adults throughout your day, multiple subject areas, possibly even across multiple grade levels. That's going to be part of this day. Because of all the things we've just talked about, you want to take some time to familiarize yourself with the school layout so that you don't get lost as you race through the building on what is usually a pretty tight schedule. If a school map is not part of your sub plans, you probably want to stop by the office and ask for one so that you don't find yourself not knowing where you are or where you need to be. And then finally, you may be expected again to implement a really structured intervention plan, especially in reading or math. So, if there's a teacher's guide left in your materials, be sure to familiarize yourself with that day's lesson before you meet with the students. Sometimes it can be misleading to think of a scripted plan as being pretty easy to implement, but often that's the opposite of the truth. So, be ready to familiarize yourself with the layout, see which parts are the scripted parts, which parts are the student parts, what materials need to be out and handy. Don't expect to be able to fake it just because it looks scripted. Those can often be the trickiest to lead. And then a final tip I want to leave you with is you might want to prepare a substitute survival kit. So, some substitutes have learned from experience to carry with them a kit like this to supplement behavior plans, content areas, or in case of those days when you show up and the schedule is all a mess and it doesn't really match the plans that you were left. And those days can be really long and challenging. Having your own survival kit can really help save that day. So, on the next slide that I'm going to share with you, I have some hyperlinks to free, easy resources for some of these items. But let's talk about some suggestions for this substitute survival kit. The first being at least one activity that's appropriate for students at each elementary grade level. And that's because I don't know if you've heard the saying before, if you don't fill the time, they will. But we know that's true. So, you want to have activities that are ready, knowing that these are going to be helpful when your lesson plans are incomplete or again, something happens to kind of change the flow for the day. You also will have those times we know at the elementary level, like that awkward 15 minutes before lunch or at dismissal time, when you don't really have a structured activity. So if you come prepared with something like that, that's going to keep students engaged and hopefully out of trouble. You also want to be ready with some visual supports or cue cards. So I've provided links to some free sites on this next slide, and I'll talk briefly about that, where you can easily download and prepare some of these to support specific students. Another thing we've already briefly talked about are visual timers. Visual timers can be found and posted through YouTube. So that's a simple way to do, and I'll share that in just a second, but also simple timers that you carry with you. So these are very helpful visual supports that help prepare students for transitions, as well as help students gauge how much time is remaining to complete a task. And that can be challenging sometimes for our students with special needs. Even carrying a small whiteboard with you can help you with those kinds of visual prompts. Giving students a quick checklist or a quick picture cue can be helpful, as well as post it notes. So, something that you're able, again, to jot down a quick checklist or a countdown for individual students can be really helpful. And then you might want to bring an engaging book for read alouds. This can be helpful for any of that downtime or that time right before dismissal. And I have a link for you that I'm going to share in just a second. So let's look at some resources for these. This slide is hyperlinked so that you can access each of these sites from your slides notes page. The first that I've linked is one of my favorites. The Puzzle Maker site allows you to quickly create and download a variety of puzzle activities such as word searches or crosswords. And so you can copy paste them into slides for virtual teaching, or you can download and print copies of them to take with you for face to face teaching. But again, just having a few of these ready to give to students that are specific to content area or seasonal can be a great way to fill the time and keep students engaged. I've also linked here Do to Learn and Victories in Autism. So both of these sites are my favorite for free, quick, downloadable visual supports. So picture cards that you can use to cue students to line up, have a seat, quiet time, things like that. Help with quick visual schedules. Some of those you're going to know more about once you get to know students in specific classrooms where you are more consistent, um, because you're going to want to know more about what you're looking for there. But these are great sites for those kinds of ready made materials once you have an idea about what your students would need. I've linked you specifically here to YouTube. So when you go to YouTube, you can search by 2-minute timer, 3-minute timer, 10-minute timer, whatever you need, and it will pop up a variety of those, which are so helpful to, again, just quickly project onto the board or use in your virtual teaching to help students gauge the time in an activity. And then the last one is a link to suggested read alouds for substitute teachers. So these are engaging read alouds that are quick and easy. Substitute teachers recommended them, and you can search by grade level, content area, seasonal, that kind of thing. It's just a really neat resource to be ready to have some of these on hand, grab them from the library, that kind of thing. So I hope you find this slide helpful. Okay, this brings us to the end of our training on supporting students with disabilities in elementary settings. Thank you so much for participating in this professional development. I've linked you here to my contact information, so please reach out if there's any way I can support you, any other resources that you might need that I can find for you. That's why I'm here. I also encourage you to follow us on Twitter because I and NKCES share many information and opportunities there as well. So now's the perfect time to look back over your slides notes document. Make sure you've captured any key information there. Review or rewind this video to look at any of those portions before you move on to the quick quiz to get your certificate of participation. Thank you so much.